Welcome to our next installment of Idea Lab. I'm ZOE HENRY, reporter with Inc., and I'm joined today by Angela Duckworth, a professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania and the author of Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, how are you?
I'm great.
So just to give some context, Angela Duckworth was designated a MacArthur Fellow, otherwise known as the MacArthur Genius Grant. However, when you were growing up, your father would not necessarily have agreed with that characterization of genius, would he?
That's absolutely right. Out of the blue, my dad would occasionally say, really apropos of nothing at all, you know, you're no genius. And I was a little girl, probably, doing my homework or watching TV, more or less minding my own business. And I did have to wonder what it was that inspired my dad to say things like that. And he wasn't a mean person, and I don't think he meant it in a mean way. But I think what he meant about himself, because I think when people are talking, they're sometimes talking to you, but they're often saying things out loud that they're saying to themselves. Right. Talking to himself and talking to me, of course, he was saying, there's not evidence here that you're a natural genius, that you're kind of off the charts and being smarter than other people. He meant what a lot of people mean when they say words like genius, natural, or talent. Somebody for whom excellence comes effortlessly, somebody who was born knowing how to dance or, dunk a basketball or solve a mathematical equation.
Let's get into your research a little bit, because I think a lot of what you do and a lot of what you talk about is this other component besides talent, besides this natural aptitude, if that in fact really exists, that is necessary for success. And that would be grit. What does that mean to have grit?
When you're trying to do something really hard, for example, trying to get an interview with a particular person and the answer is no, and then you ask again and the answer is still no, and you ask the assistant and you make a contact with somebody else and the answer is still no. The question is, do you give up or do you keep trying? And to some extent, what it means to be a gritty person is to not give up, to keep trying.
And how do you measure grit? I hear that you have this grit scale.
When I started studying grit, the first thing I needed to do is figure out how to measure it. And I didn't want to just, think about it, right? Or reflect on, stories. I really wanted to have data. So I started out by interviewing people who were super achievers, people who were at the top of their field and, in sports, the arts, politics, business, and I asked them to describe other superachievers, the people that they most admired. And the grit scale is a questionnaire that almost verbatim captures the qualities that were described to me. The two themes being passion over the long term, married with perseverance over the long term. And that same questionnaire is what I put into the book so people can figure out, if they answer honestly, how gritty they are.
So tell me a little bit about the business executives that you've interviewed, the entrepreneurs. Do you find that they're very gritty people, and do you think that grit is necessary to achieve success in business?
To be perfectly honest, I have not yet met a world-class executive who is not a paragon of grit, of passion and perseverance. One of the people that knows a lot about grit is Jamie Dimon, who's of course the leader of JP Chase, one of the largest banks in the world. What was interesting to me about that conversation is that what he chose to begin with when I started to ask him about his success was actually a story about his failure. The first thing that he said to me was like, let me tell you about the time I was fired. That is actually, I think, the kind of thing that I'm learning from people who exemplify grit. In Jamie's case, that it's not about being invulnerable and it's not about being perfect. What Jamie took out of that experience is that how you react to that failure is signature to who you are as a leader. Not the failure itself, but your reaction to that.
Another example that you point to in your book is the founder of Shopify, Toby Lütke.
Toby was, growing up and in Germany and, not demonstrating any of the hallmarks of future success, right? And in particular, he was doing horribly badly in his academic classes, although he was very smart, I think. And so he ended up doing this kind of vocational internship and programming, and he had a mentor named Jürgen. But every time before work ended, Toby would print out the code that he had written and give it to Jürgen, and Jürgen would overnight with a red marker, mark it up and show what he could have done better. And through this cycle of continuous improvement, Toby did improve. And not only did he improve in his coding, his confidence improved. And finally, there came a day where a very important client was supposed to be walked through the new software that had been developed. And Jürgen said to Toby, you're going to take this, not me. And I think that's what you find with people who are very gritty, that there was a mentor in their life who pushed them hard beyond what they thought they could do at the moment.
How do you find the balance between pushing yourself enough to get to where you need to go and just completely derailing yourself?
It's for that person that you're coaching, what is just beyond what they can do. I'm not saying that it's easy to figure that out, but that's what you're aiming for, right? Not what they can do comfortably, not what's impossible for them to do, but something with, some support they could get there. And in fact, actually, when you ask developmental psychologists how children grow up and how do they learn to walk and how do they learn to talk and do all the things that grown-ups do, what's really important is that they're constantly being asked to do things that are just beyond what they can comfortably do now. And we have to learn to do that as grown-ups.
Yeah. And speaking about pushing yourself beyond limits or to the limit, let's talk a little bit about West Point. I know that you've done a fair amount of research there. You've applied the grit scale, which has successfully predicted which cadets would make it through Beast Barracks, which is this beginning training course that is infamously very, very hard to complete. What do you think that entrepreneurs can learn from West Point cadets?
The fascinating thing about West Point is that it takes really 2 years. If you think about the admission process to college, which we both know pretty well, it's pretty tough, it's very stressful. That pales in comparison to what it takes to get into a place like West Point, the congressional recommendation, the physical fitness test. And I think the fascinating thing about this admissions process is that nevertheless, you have cadets who are admitted, 18-year-old men and women who could make it through West Point and do well, but who drop out before, for example, that first summer of Beast Barracks training is over. So the question is, for an entrepreneur, how is my life like Beast Barracks, right? I think what it has in common is you're in a place where you're doing things that you've never done before, that you're possibly failing at, or at least below average. And I think we face that decision, do I stick with this thing and commit to finishing and commit to improving on my weaknesses, or do I take the easier path, which is to drop out?
I mean, at West Point, for instance, you don't necessarily have someone who's really coaching you, but you have people who have done this successfully. What can you do when you're an entrepreneur and you're starting something completely new? You might not necessarily have guidance in your particular area. I mean, what advice would you have for someone like that?
Here, I think we can think about what it is about people who can do what some of the most successful people that I've studied do, which is to find a mentor to give them the coaching and also the support that they need, right? So how do I become the sort of person who mentors would like to mentor? I recently did a talk at an investment bank called Evercore, and one of the senior executives said to the group of more junior executives, figure out how you can be a great mentee. That will attract a great mentor, and that is a big part of actually becoming better and better at what you do.
There's this one anecdote in your book where you recall a radio commentator observing Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton and their communication styles. And he effectively says, both are very good communicators, but while Bill is a natural, Hillary is obviously trying. She's a little bit more stilted. She's not a natural in the way that Bill is. So A, what do you think about that? What does that sort of indicate about our perception of effort as a society? And then B, what do you think that entrepreneurs maybe could learn from Hillary Clinton's work ethic?
This contrast that many of us have, and I'll confess to having it myself, really, especially before I got deep into the research, is that there are naturals, and they're the winners, and they're the ones for whom things really come spontaneously without any training or experience. And then there are the strivers who sort of claw their way to, maybe almost as high a bar, but not quite. And that really is the, Bill Clinton versus Hillary Clinton contrast that a lot of us have. I have some perspective on this too, because I was in the speechwriting department for a summer during the Clinton administration, and it's even at the level of being, that close to things, people would often talk about Bill as being a complete natural.
Really?
Now, what I think is absolutely true is that there are people who have aptitudes and interests that are genetic, that incline them in a certain direction. You know, people who are interested in communicating to other people and who are sensitive to, okay, I noticed that person's not looking at me anymore, so maybe they're not interested anymore. That I think is real. And so I don't want to say that there's no such thing as talent. By the same token, when Bill Clinton was born, he was a baby, and babies don't know anything. So he had to, at some point in his life, acquire speech-making skills. And the question in my mind is, however you easily or with more difficulty acquire these things, you do, at the end of the day, have to practice and acquire them. And so, to some extent, even naturals are also strivers.
And what do you think about the political candidates? Would you say that maybe one of them is grittier than another based on what you've seen in debates or campaigns?
I think that at the level of, being a presidential candidate for the United States of America, you have to be at a pretty high threshold of grit. It's, inconceivable to me that you would get there without being very, very passionate and very, very persevering.
Right.
Whether you're right about all your policy positions is a completely separate question.
Why don't we talk a little bit about applications of grit in the workplace? So say I'm an entrepreneur and I want to hire a really great gritty workforce, right? Early stages of the company, don't necessarily have a lot of capital, need to be really tight, and I don't want a lot of turnover in the next 6 months, the next year, which means that I probably want some gritty employees. What can entrepreneurs be on the lookout for when hiring employees?
Leaders want gritty people on their team, and the question is, how do I find them, and how do I know before I've had that person work for me which are those gritty people?
Right.
The one thing I would not do is, give them a questionnaire where they can fake their answer, right? I think a questionnaire like the Grit Scale is awesome for reflection.
Right.
Not so great for hiring.
It's totally fakeable, right?
It's completely fakeable, right? I am a hard worker. I finish whatever I begin. I think I know how to get a grit score of 5 out of 5, right? But the second thing that people have, sometimes think about, leaders say like, oh, I'll interview for it, right? I'll sit down with this person for a good 45-minute conversation, and I'll ask them about their failures and their setbacks, and then I'll be able to figure out how gritty they are. I think there too, I'm not confident that really, talking to somebody about what they did do or what they could have done or, how they think about things, I'm not sure that that's really an accurate assessment of their grit. When I think of grit, I think, is this person going to wake up tomorrow morning and be pointing in the same direction? How hard are they really going to work after their first performance review? When they're actually doing well at their job, are they going to be hungry to get even better, relentlessly committed to excellence? All of those things are easy to talk about in 45 minutes, very, very hard to do. My best idea is to look at somebody's resume and look for evidence of grit. Where are the trends there that say, oh yeah, this person did something for not 1 year, but a number of years? And then ask the question, okay, what evidence do I have that they actually progressed in that? When we code resumes for that, we can actually predict all the same things as we do with the grit scale.
Yeah, that's sort of interesting because I feel like it's a popular idea right now that maybe actually hopping jobs and trying a bunch of different things is actually better for your career. I mean, I think there's research that shows that more millennials are doing that than their parents were or than previous generations were.
So what's fascinating about the millennial, we kind of like to bash millennials, right?
Yes.
You're one, so you've been bashed actually, right? By people like me who are older, and we like to complain about how, you hop jobs. And you look at the National Bureau of Labor Statistics, which actually tracks that sort of thing, and 20-somethings today are no more mobile than 20-somethings were a decade ago, two decades ago, going back to when the data were being collected.
Right.
So it's actually not true that millennials job hop more than 20-somethings in previous generations. What is true is that they job hop more than 40-year-olds like me, 40-somethings, or 60-somethings. And I think the reason is that 20-somethings don't know yet what they want to do, and so they are exploring.
Right.
Whereas by the time you're, 60-something, one hopes you've figured it out. Exactly. Trial and error. Trial and error. Yeah.
Right. Because I find that some of the grittiest people that you've interviewed, that you speak about in your book, didn't have a linear path to to what they're doing to success, right? The former East Africa bureau chief for the New York Times, who knew that he loved East Africa, but didn't necessarily think that journalism was, what he wanted to do with his life. So he sort of, through this roundabout way, became a journalist as a way of getting to East Africa. And to me, that's sort of interesting. That reflects this trajectory of grit that isn't straight and narrow. You do kind of have to try a bunch of different things and see what sticks, right?
I think that when you look at very mature, gritty people, people who I would call, paragons of grit because they fully exemplify passion and perseverance, it's true that they have this kind of life organizing, top level goal. You can call it an ultimate concern, something for which all the other things that they're trying to do are really just means to ends, right? Like means to this one thing that they're trying to accomplish. But then you can ask, well, how did they get that way, right? They usually didn't, have this vision of where they ultimately wanted to go until at some point where they were kind of halfway in the middle of exploring and getting there. So they have these low-level goals, these mid-level goals. At some point they realize, what? I want to be in the Olympics. But it didn't start out that way.
Right.
Jeff Gettleman, if you talked to him when he was 18, you said, what? I think you're going to become a journalist someday. I don't know that he would have believed you.
How does that sort of reflect on maybe choosing a business idea? I think that you could talk to a lot of people about to start their own companies who think, wow, I could do this, or I could do this, or I could do this. And you sort of have to find the balance between something that's realistic. There is actually a market there, and this could work, and something that you're passionate about, right? So how do you choose your business idea?
Yeah, when you're choosing a business idea, here's one way I think that you can make these decisions. For a lot of people, they think, oh, the business idea is, starting a cookie business, right? Is that actually the idea that motivates you, or is it something a little bit more abstract? So is it the cookie business, or is it that I like baking and food and I want to take care of people? I think actually trying to introspect and say, what is it that I am really passionate about? It's not usually the very, very particular, concrete specifics. It is usually something more general, and that should be the compass. That should be what guides you.
And then once you start your company, how do you think that grit affects the way that an entrepreneur leads, right? So, you could think about things like raising venture capital. You need to raise capital, but at the same time, that means that you do have to give over some control. Some other people are going to have a stake in your business. So how would a gritty person sort of manage that? Would they avoid raising capital?
All these local decisions, should I take the VC funding? Should I, keep the equity here? Should I outsource this function, or should I keep it in-house? They're really for a bigger purpose. I think the ultimate concern here is to build the best business that I can. Whether I take the VC capital or not is just a question of is that going to advance that higher level goal?
But doesn't a gritty person want to sort of own their idea and be able to control the trajectory?
I think the idea of grit is about trying to achieve something that's really important and interesting to you. If that means, in some cases, giving up a little of the control, these things, if they get you to where ultimately you want to go, then that's grit.
Who do you think is the grittiest entrepreneur you've ever interviewed?
Well, one of the people that I studied, although I mostly talked to his mom, Jackie, is Jeff Bezos, who's, of course, the founder of Amazon.com. One of the things that Jackie Bezos, his mom, did was to encourage his interests. For Jeff, it was problem solving. He used to take apart things and build because he was fascinated with how to fix stuff. And in a way, Amazon.com is just one big problem solver. I think that the idea of asking yourself, what am I so interested in that even if I didn't get paid, would I be thrilled to do? Would I could genuinely say I love my work? I think that's the direction which you'll also be the most successful in.
Right. What do parents need to be doing or thinking about to raise gritty kids?
So I've got 2 kids at home, and actually they're 2 girls, and one's 14 and one just turned 13. And I had the first one just before going to get my PhD, and the second one in my first year. So in a way, I kind of grew up as a psychologist studying the science of excellence at the same time as I was raising
living it.
Living it. It was so here's one thing that I took home as a lesson, based on the research, but actually, just as much based on my experience as a mom. I told my kids when they were even 5 or 6 years old that I did want them to do something, even at that young age, that was hard. And what I meant by hard is the kind of practice that experts do, constantly working on something that is for them, a relative weakness, right? So not a place where you would go and people would just praise you and then you would go home, but actually I want you to hold your arm this way when we do this exactly, which is actually both of them ended up in ballet. Now, I didn't let them quit. They were only allowed to quit at the end of the tuition payment. So there was a little parental enforcement because when it was a sunny day and they wanted to go play outside instead of going to the ballet studio, they asked me if they could quit. But no, I didn't let them quit until it was a natural stopping point. I think that the leaders of this world are all parents. The word parent means to bring forth. And that's what a true leader does. They are bringing out the best in you. And so the great people that I've interviewed who are themselves mature paragons of grit are in most cases themselves mentoring the next generation.
Do you think that grit guarantees happiness? I mean, we talk a lot about the psychological price of entrepreneurship. Once you have a successful company, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are happy.
When I look at the question scientifically, and we measure grit in the same people in which we measure their life satisfaction, their happiness, or we could do it different ways, measuring how much positive emotion they have, or the opposite of that, how much negative emotion you have. Crystal clear picture, which is that grit and happiness and well-being go hand in hand. So the people who are at the top of the charts for me on grit are also, in my research, at the top of the charts on happiness. That said, it doesn't mean grit's a guarantee because this is a relationship. It's on average, people who are high in grit on average are happy with their lives, but it is the clear trend. I think for me, the question is, how can they be so happy with their lives when they're constantly trying to improve and they're always looking to be something better than they were yesterday? And I think the answer is that I can say of myself that I am comfortable being uncomfortable. I am satisfied being dissatisfied with the last thing that I did. And that kind of process of always trying to get better for me it's self-gratifying in a way that's different from pleasure.
Yeah, but you make this really interesting point in your book about you haven't necessarily interviewed the wives or the children of some of these super successful executives, Jamie Dimon, Toby Litka. So it's sort of hard to tell, right? I mean, does grit come at the expense maybe of your personal life?
It is an excellent question to ask whether gritty people are themselves super happy with their lives, but at the expense of all the nearest and dearest to them.
Right.
And I haven't actually collected any data on that, but I do have 2 daughters and a husband, so I simply asked them. And I even just the other day asked my 14-year-old, I mean, she knows that I'm here doing the interview and I'm therefore not at home when she comes back from school. And she did say to me, like, I wish you were home, I wish you weren't gonna have to go to New York for that interview.
Yeah.
And then I said to her, like, do you think that it would be better if I were a little less gritty?
Yeah.
And she took a moment to think about it, and she said, no, I think you're pretty great. So for me, I think there are these trade-offs, absolutely. But one of the things I'm trying to do as a parent is to show to my daughters what it means to pursue a career that is deeply meaningful to you and infinitely interesting, always trying to get better and always getting up when things don't go right.
Do you have advice for entrepreneurs who maybe struggle with this idea of work-life balance?
Being an entrepreneur, like so many other really challenging things, is an endurance sport, right? It is not a sprint. It is truly a marathon. You do have to think about, how can I take care of myself so that I can be here, not just tomorrow, right? But for the long run. That does mean taking time to exercise. That does mean, calling your best friend. When you let yourself do the things that you've kind of sworn off because they're not supposed to be part of the goal, they actually end up helping you get there. Yeah.
Right, because you could be wasting time stressing out or crying when you could be calling someone who could give you emotional support who might actually help you achieve a goal even faster, right?
Yeah, it's not just about working harder and longer. It is about working smarter, right? And one thing that's really interesting to me talking to business leaders and executives is that sometimes they feel like the younger people coming up don't do enough periodic reflection.
I'm wondering if you think that women entrepreneurs have to be grittier than their male counterparts.
I've been asked this question by a lot of very successful women executives and also, for example, women who make it to partner in law firms. And their hypothesis is that, in fact, you do need more grit to be a woman because in addition to all the challenges that both men and women face, you have extra ones. Challenges that you would say, well, they shouldn't be there, but they are there.
How do you create a gritty culture?
2 things culturally, I think, support grit. One is that it does need to be a culture of high expectations, of we're never done improving. The Japanese word for this is kaizen, right?
Yeah.
And I do think a culture of kaizen can be intentionally created by a leader. The second thing I think that a leader needs to do is to be truly unconditionally supportive. For the people who work for you, they need to feel two kinds of support. I'll use the word affection, or some leaders have even said love to me, which they really do mean it in the sense that like you are truly caring for these people as other human beings. The other kind of support is autonomy support, is the jargony psychological term,
right?
But I think of it as respect. If you can be a leader who says, look, I am demanding, but I really care about you, and I really respect you as an individual. When you say that you have a different opinion than me, I'm actually listening because I think you have something that's valuable to say. That combination of demand and support is very powerful in forging grit.
When you're a startup, I think it's probably pretty easy to make or not easy, but it's simpler to make your employees feel supported, right? It's simpler to see what's going on, to be able to give them tasks and see how well they're excelling. But as you grow, it's a lot harder to, be as focused on creating that culture. So do you have any advice for maintaining that feel as the company gets larger?
I would take a page actually from people like Jamie Dimon or Kat Cole. They really try to build a core team, an executive team that is really consistently emphasizing the same values, the same traditions that they would themselves, so that they don't have to be in every meeting, that they now have other people who are saying the same thing. And I think human beings are very good at actually emulating somebody who is in a more senior position.
And that sort of begs the question, like, how do you look for a co-founder?
I just went through this process, so I have a nonprofit. So I'm an entrepreneur in a sense because I started a nonprofit, but of course it's a nonprofit, not a for-profit company. I had the same problem that many entrepreneurs did. I knew that I didn't have all the skills that you would need to make this nonprofit accomplish its mission, which is advancing the science and practice of character development. I had the science part, but I didn't have the educational practice part. So I looked around for somebody who would complement me. That said, though Donald and I have different skills, we're both extremely gritty, and I simply can't imagine this working out very well if we weren't well matched in how hard we were willing to work, our passion for the goal of this organization. So we are matched on grit, but different in our skills.
There's one moment in your book where you're describing coming up to an esteemed colleague, an esteemed person in psychology, Marty Seligman.
My advisor,
your advisor,
my PhD advisor.
Your advisor.
Yeah.
You're sort of telling him about your research, and he looks at you and he goes, "You haven't had a good idea in 2 years." Then he says, "You need to stop reading so much and start thinking." What did that mean to you, and was it helpful? Because I hear you developed a formula for achievement after that.
What Marty meant by that is that you cannot come up with a great idea simply by reading other people's ideas. And he wanted me to draw on my own experience. I realized that he was right. Could he have said it a different way? Maybe. But the thing that Marty was pointing out was that I was doing these studies, and each of the studies was fine. I mean, they were interesting, but they didn't add up to an overall theory of achievement. And he knew that if I were going to really make a difference, that I had to put it all together. And that's what the book is. When we think about achieving something, no matter what it is, making a better roast chicken or, selling more units, it's always going from here to there. It's always going from where I am right now to where I want to be. And when I thought about it, I thought, distance. What do we know about distance? And I remember in my high school physics class where we all learned, I think, distance equals rate times time, right? So to get somewhere, you have to be traveling a certain speed and you travel for a certain amount of time. And the faster you go and the more time you spend, well, the farther you get.
Right.
And I think in a very real sense, achievement is like skill times effort. Then you can ask the question, okay, where do these skills come from? That, I think, has another equation. Effort's in this equation too, because it requires you to try. But the thing that you're multiplying effort by is talent, right? So how much better do I get every time I give an interview? Oh, wow, I'm really talented. Every time I do an interview, I get a lot better. So if you put these two equations together, right, and you do a little bit of algebra, you get achievement is equal to talent times effort times effort, and effort counts twice because effort helps you build your skill. So I think my meta theory is that achievement is a product of both talent and effort, but in some sense, effort counts twice.
Thank you so much for your time today and for joining us for Idea Lab.
Thank you so much. It's been a total pleasure.